কিন্তু প্রিন্স আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে ওকে শুরু করতে পারো 4টে বাজে তো
শুরু করে দেবো
আর একটু 5 মিনিট দেখবে নাকি মানে পার্টিসিপেন্টস আর স্টিল another 5 minutes and then
Participants are also joining through YouTube.
yes.
And it's almost 20 there.
What is the number till now?
Participants are also joining through YouTube.
Yes. I think we have around 100 participants.
133 সঞ্চিতা দি আপাতত
ও আচ্ছা তাহলে তো অনেকেই এসে গেছে
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ নবমিতা অনেকেই তো এসে গেছে our respected speaker is also waiting
so should we start
you want to start now you can start now because Munmun
we should start now
yes participants have already joined in so
I think Navamita you start
yes yes
A very good evening to our distinguished speaker of the day, Professor Anup Dhar, and our very dear participants. We are about to begin the second session of this two-day webinar titled Death, Anxiety and the Contagion, Biopsychological and Philosophical Insights. I would Memorial Girls College, Sanjita Shen, to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Navamita.
Please deliver the
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I feel honored to be invited to deliver the welcome address in this second session of the two-day webinar organized by the Department of Psychology, Gokhale Memorial Girls College. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome our honorable speaker, Dr. Anup Dhar, Professor, School of Liberal Studies, Director, Center for Development Practice, and all the participants who have joined us in this virtual meet in overwhelming numbers, my colleagues and friends. While the diagnosis leading to the event of death is studied by pathologists and medical practitioners, human reactions to death are studied by psychologists. They have theories to explain our behaviors leading up to our own deaths and following the death of others. In this COVID-19 pandemic, we avoid discussing death consciously, as it requires us to accept our vulnerability as mortals, despite great strides made in medical science and increase in life expectancies. In today's session, we will walk with Dr. Anup Dhar as he unfolds the psychological and physical perspectives to anxiety related to death, which is a fear and a universal truth. Welcoming everyone once again, I give it over to Navamita to introduce our notable speaker of the day. Thank you. Navamita.
Thank you very much, Sanjita Di. Our very eminent speaker for this session, Professor Anup Dhar, is so very well known for his erudition in the academic circle that he hardly needs an introduction. Moreover, no words can do justice to his remarkable, almost overwhelming achievement and contribution in his field and beyond. Anup Dhar is the professor of philosophy, School of Liberal Studies. He's also the director, Center for Development Practice at the Ambedkar University, Delhi, India. His co-edited books include Breaking the Silo, Immigrant Science Education in India, Orient Black Swan 2017, Psychoanalysis in Indian Terror, Emerging Themes in Culture, Family and Childhood, Lexington Brooks 2018, Clinic, Critique and Culture, Philosophy and Praxis of Psychoanalysis in India, which is his forthcoming work, Orient Black Swan 2020. He's currently working on an annotated edition of the English writings of Girindra Shikhar Bose titled Aboriginal Psychoanalysis. Sir, we gave a very brief introduction. I would now request Professor Anup Dhar to kindly begin his address. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Navumita. Thanks a lot to the department as well, because we usually don't take up such topics. And when Navumita wrote to me, I just could not say no, though I was perhaps not directly working on this, but I wanted to respond to the COVID-19 situation, and which is why I took it up. So thanks a lot to all of you. Onek dhonnobad to have invited me to do this. I have been thinking very hard since Navumita said, do this talk if you can do this talk. And I will share my thoughts on this today, how I am experiencing this question, this problematic, and how can we think about it. Okay, I wrote it down, so I will read a little bit and speak a little bit. Navumita, am I clearly audible? So then I know clearly audible, right? Huh?
Yes,
so
audible,
then I
visible.
know I'm at a right distance from the laptop. Yeah. So let me go through a few problems that I will highlight today in the time I have. These problems will give us a sense of how we can relate to the question of death anxiety in the contemporary. And the contemporary is very, very important. We all know what is the backdrop, and it's against that backdrop, in light of that backdrop, or in the darkness of that backdrop, we are going to think about the question of death anxiety. Problematic one, let me put it this way, it comes from largely an evolutionary question. And what we see from an evolutionary angle is that most of the species who had inhabited this earth once upon a time no longer exist. And that attests to the whole process of quote unquote, what could be called natural selection, and attests to the great difficulty that organisms have on the deepest biological level in achieving any measure of success over the powerful threat of extermination. So there is a long angle, long temporal angle, a long history called evolution, not a short history that we study in history books, which could be a history of 2,000 or 3,000 or even 5,000 years. But here we are talking of a much longer duration. And there the threat of extermination is really high. For virtually the majority of species, at times even including the bacteria, defeat to death is inevitable, perhaps, and that is one problematic we will have to keep in mind when we are trying to think death anxiety within psychology. I'll come to psychology, but let me reach there step by step. This, of course, opens up two questions with respect to the human organism. And let us not forget the human organism is also a four-legged mammal. Okay, let's keep this as again another backdrop. There is a pervasive external threat to which we respond, as also in the human organism, especially internal forms of peril resulting from dysfunctions within the organism. And we have had, perhaps through again natural selection, self-healing capacities or capabilities developing in us, sensory nerve endings that were directed internally, and receptor functions, as also, most importantly, pain endings. Pain as a central feature of this newly emerging inner directed warning system. So the human body has this rather complex and sophisticated experience of pain. It also connects to another problematic to which I cannot go today, the question of mirror neurons and how we feel the pain of the other. Let's not go there today. So struggles between causes of death, threat of death, means of dealing with death, at times, quote unquote, defeating them, is an ever-present issue for all species, including humans. And here, let's keep as a running footnote the question of suicide, where we take our own life. So it's not that we are only trying to avoid death, we are also sometimes walking towards death. We also see elaborate symbolic cultural response to death. Perhaps the first human burial sites and religious rituals around death, which we would call also culture as a response to death, culture as a response to dealing with death, the death ritual as a response to an experience of the nothing. And this has given to us a very complex relationship with death, and maybe death anxiety and its maladaptive consequences are a kind of price humans pay for their extraordinary language-based survival enhancing skills. And we have a very complex relationship with death. We turn away from death, we deny death, there is denial. We run away from death, we walk towards death. We have elaborate cultural symbolic forms of dealing with death, with the experience of nothing, with the experience of absence of a near one, and we respond to that in complex ways. And over here, existential questions regarding death continue to haunt us. Death is, on the one hand, the threat of non-existence, that I may not be there tomorrow. On the other, it is also a realization of a future non-existence, and it's a precondition of a fuller understanding of our life, and eventually a precondition for freeing ourselves from anxiety. Now, how would that happen, etc., is a serious question. Are we in that sense? And these are important insights, actually, from existentialism or phenomenological moments in philosophy. Are we walking towards death? Is the question of being a being towards death? Is 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 every day one more day closer towards death? And how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this understanding? And that opens up the question: what is life then? What is life? I will come to this in a little more detail as we go along. Death also, very interestingly, is in the future for all of us. But paradoxically, my death is not in my future. That is a future I will not be there to live, actually. And death in that sense, death is a very complex experience, actually. It puts to question the very question of experience. The moment I experience death, I am not there to experience death. Mark the paradox over here. The moment I'm going to experience death, I will not be there to experience it anymore. And in that sense, death itself will reduce one's existence to what this existence really is, a nothing, and a nothing waits for us. And in that sense, it is not easy to reflect on death, and one could remain anxious about death in terms of two moments. One, its impending nature. It is to come. It is going to come, but we don't know when it's going to come. It's a guest who comes uninvited. Okay, this is a guest you cannot invite. You cannot pre-invite. So there cannot be any anticipation. There is very little chance of a prior preparation for death. And it's perhaps going to be always untimely. Its time will never come in a predictable way. You cannot predict its coming. And in that sense, it's a guest who comes uninvited. This opens up a question for us. What then is death? So one is to actually talk about, well, death anxiety is this. This is the definition of death anxiety. This is how you deal with it. These are the scales, and this is how you measure death anxiety. That is one. The other is to see death as a daily experience. It's not the experience of only a cancer patient. It's a daily experience. And one thing COVID-19 has done to us, it has made the experience of death ubiquitous. It has made the experience of death once again a daily possible experience, an impending experience, a guest who could come uninvited, in spite of the many times we wash our hands and the many masks we wear. What has happened then in the contemporary? What is going on in the contemporary? And what are the questions the contemporary is throwing up for psychology? That how would psychology respond to this very complex contemporary when death is, of course, knocking at our doors, but very interestingly, death comes to our room without a knock. We cannot anticipate its arrival. We cannot invite it. It comes uninvited. And in that sense, the question that opens up is, what is human life then? What is life? What is life? What is it that this life is? And psychology, especially existential psychology and existential philosophy, has tried to really understand very, very seriously the question of life and the question of self. We will come to that. Just hold on a little bit. But the question I want to raise over here for us today is, and it's a question to which I don't have a very good answer, but I want to share this question with you all. What happens to psychology in the contemporary? And that is where I want to reach, actually. That what will happen to psychology today? Not what will psychology do with death anxiety, but what will happen to the discipline of psychology? How would the discipline of psychology respond to this? Would there be a disciplinary movement in psychology today? Would psychology rethink itself given the experience of the contemporary, given that death is not the experience of a cancer patient anymore, and it's not a question of running a scale on a cancer patient. Death is a daily, ubiquitous experience for all of us, maybe all of us who are in the Zoom room now. In that sense, the contemporary is throwing up a serious question to psychology, actually. What is death? And if death is also unknowable, if death is an experience we cannot know, because the moment we know death, we are not there to know it anymore. And that's a very complex experience. And what do we do with this? And the question that then opens up, if this is the question of death, what is the question of anxiety? If I'm going to work on this couple, death anxiety, the second term in death anxiety is anxiety. And anxiety is a complex experience. And in advanced post-Freudian psychoanalysis, we have tried to see anxiety as that which is there without, as if, a cause. It is something which is there because something is unknowable. And somewhere, anxiety and unknowability, I don't know what I'm anxious about, but I'm anxious. Anxiety is as if without a cause. A phobia has a cause. Fear has an object. Phobia has an object. Fear may have a cause, but anxiety is as if without a cause and an object. And anxiety is tied somewhere to unknowability, something that I don't know. And death is the experience in human life that is unknowable. That is one experience we will only experience and not be there to experience the moment we experience it. Okay, and that is the serious problem death poses for us, actually, the impossibility of knowing death. And is anxiety tied to that impossibility of knowing, that unknowability that is there at the crux of the experience of death, and hence death anxiety. The whole literature of death anxiety somewhere has to deal with this twofold problematic. One, inevitability; two, its impending nature; three, its unknowability, its arrival without invitation; and four, anxiety tied to unknowability. This has opened up two angles, and as I was tracking the death anxiety literature, I was seeing a twofold movement over here. One attempt is to mark death between life and life. Now, how is that? So one attempt is to put death as flanked by life. You have life and you have afterlife, which is why some of those studies have seen that some kind of religious experience, some kind of faith, spirituality, belief in the transcendental, sometimes belief in God, belief in afterlife has reduced death anxiety. As if death is flanked on two sides by life. You have biological life on one side of death, and you have an afterlife on the other side of death. Psychoanalysis, however, doesn't offer us such an optimistic view. It offers us a more difficult view of life. I won't call it pessimistic, but a more difficult, a more intolerable view of life, and one has to learn to deal with it, where life is flanked by death. So you have an inorganic moment at the beginning of life, and then at the end of life, you have death, and again, an inorganic moment. So you have death, life, death. Whereas in the more afterlife kind of thinking, it is life, death, afterlife. And this has led to two questions in psychology or existential psychology. And the two questions are troubling questions, actually. Do we tolerate death because we know it is flanked by life, life and afterlife? Or, and this is really troubling, do we tolerate life because we know there is an end to it all? Because this life is not necessarily good life, as we have seen in Black Lives Matter, or as we have seen with our migrant workers in COVID-19, who had to walk sometimes more than 1,000 kilometers back to their homes. Life is not so tolerable. Do we tolerate life because we know there is an end to it all? And that gives a very, very different turn to the question of death anxiety. I will leave you with these questions and go to the second problematic and spend about 5 minutes on the second problematic. It builds on the first. Our usual tendency, and this I take from Tagore, from Rabindranath, our usual tendency is to see life and death in a zoological way. There is life and then there is death. Final, black and white. However, Tagore alerts us to a botanical understanding of life and death, which is not black and white, which is not a finality, which could be understood in terms of green and yellow, not black and white. How green and yellow? A tree has leaves, and leaves are green. Some leaves will turn yellow and fall. The tree is a complex continuum of green leaves and yellow leaves. And there is a certain contingency. And we are never then fully alive or fully dead. As we speak, our skin cells are dying. Hence, we are never fully alive or fully dead. And hence, death needs to be seen as a sign, as a kind of contingent moment in our life rather than a finality. And this deals with the question of death very, very differently. That we accept that there are moments of life and death in our living time as well. Our skin cells die as we live. And that is a very complex understanding of life and death. It's not a simple finality that here was a living organism and here it is dead. and we continue to live, perhaps even after death, in complex symbolic forms. And in that sense, the relationship with death would be very, very different. And there is death, there is suffering. Ache dukkho, ache mrityu. These two are there. There is dukkha, there is death, there is mrityu. And these two are experiences, and how do we deal with these two experiences, which are constitutive of the human condition? What has happened in the contemporary that we have forgotten that death and suffering are constitutive of the human condition? And that is a question that I will explore in the third part. Just hold on to it. This opens up a question of looking at death very, very differently. And what I'll end with today, having a very, very different relationship with vulnerability. Rethinking the kind of unthinking omnipotence we are trying to walk into. I'll come to this slowly, okay? And how psychology is a very important experience to acknowledge, be humbled by our own vulnerability, to accept our own vulnerability, ache dukkho, ache mrityu, to accept that there is suffering and there is death, to accept that there is death in a contingent, continuous, present, continuous manner. Now,
Participants, please mute yourselves.
okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, I thought somebody was saying something. So how we look at death, not in a kind of, well, this is life and then there is death, but death as a present continuous experience. Our skin cells die as we live. And in that sense, the anxiety of the unknowable would take a very, very different form. And the question I want to ask, what has happened in the contemporary that we cannot deal with our vulnerability, that we cannot deal with unknowability, that we have exceptional anxiety regarding the unknowable? What is this omnipotence to know? What is this omnipotence of the self that one cannot experience vulnerability, one cannot acknowledge vulnerability? And in that sense, how does one relate to the untimely call of death and the unhomely invitation of death? We don't know where we'll die, how we'll die, when we will die. Why do we have exceptional anxiety with respect to three unknowns: when, where, how? Why is this unknowability giving us so much anxiety? And that is a question one may think of. And does psychology have something really exceptional to offer over here? I'll come to the third section. This section is actually looking at what happened in the contemporary, what has happened in late 20th century that we are finding it very difficult to cope with many, many things. One is death anxiety. Does then psychology show us a way here, just like psychology perhaps showed us a way in 19th century, in late 19th century? My problematic three now, and this is the last. I have about 10 minutes, I think. Let me see if I can do justice to this third problematic. As I have shared with you all, one of the fundamental experiences of psychology or psychotherapy, or even psychoanalysis, if you want to go over there, is to actually make us understand, experience, reconcile with our own vulnerability as against a kind of naive assertion of omnipotence. And what has happened in the contemporary, where I see some kind of a monster self born of continuous efforts, striving to achieve bodily youth and an accomplished narcissistic picture of oneself. What remains because of this extreme narcissism can hardly be called human. And therefore, what happens is that we have a very, very fragile relationship with both unknowability and vulnerability. And do we need psychology? Do we need psychotherapy? Do we need psychoanalysis to make us set up once again a relationship with our vulnerability and with unknowability? And really rethink this kind of monster self-born of our continuous efforts striving to achieve bodily youth and an accomplished narcissistic picture. Next, what psychoanalysis and psychology, psychotherapy managed to do in late 19th century was to produce an understanding of the subject of the self with respect to what at that time they called the repressive hypothesis, as if our sexualized selves have been repressed by a kind of moral, normative, normalized Oedipal order, the law of the father, the name of the father, and how do we reconcile between a repressed self and an apparently liberated self? That is where the dukkha, the suffering, was located. Death was also located, very interestingly, in late 19th century psychology in terms of the death of eros. The death was not simply biological death, it was the death of eros, the limitation on eros, and one had to learn to deal with it. The function of the taboo, the function of the totem, were all ways to limit eros, and that was that present, continuous, contingent death. There's death in life. There is death at the very birth of life, the death of eros, the death of sexuality, and that is how we go about. What happens in the contemporary? Extreme technological processes of surveillance, datafication of contemporary life, behavior modification, instrumentalization, a new normalization in which the self collapses under an excess of freedom. An excess of freedom, the freedom to consume, excess of consumption, excess of the market, the consequent collapse of social structures, human relationship. On the other hand, excess determinism, a twofold life on the one hand. If it was repression, liberation in late 19th century, the new subject is perhaps torn between an excess of freedom, a self that collapses under an excess of freedom, and on the other hand, complete determinism, algorithmic forms of data, circuits of surveillance, technological abstraction. The individual is excessively free, but at the same time, completely wired into a cybernetic system where behavior is translated into codes, and we have a machinic future. A cybernetic self, a kind of fatal mechanization, life in the new cybernetic society, switching between either being completely null or void, zero, or hyper-connected to everybody and everything. A dystopian online world caught between Boolean alternatives of all and nothing. Excessive connection and communication, or the collapse of connection and communication. Zero or infinity. Torn between this bipolarity, what could be called the Boolean man, this bipolarity, a kind of cultural shift when we really cannot deal with vulnerability and unknowability. A kind of psychology in a high-tech society, a kind of cybernetic dystopia. And this cybernetic self, this cybernetic dystopia, a robotized humanity and everything else, the organic, thrown out of existence. Playfully, a Lacanian psychoanalyst has called it the death of death. As if there is a death of death. As if one cannot deal with death anymore. There is too much life. There is too much life. And where is this life? A life of humanity that is extremely cybernetic, machinic, a humanity endlessly in a default cybernetic system. And the tipping point was perhaps modernity. Now, this is not to say this is a new phenomenon. We have always been machinic. The human has always had a technological side to it. Computers are not technological. Even that little twig with which the Paleolithic man would dig out an insect from earth, that little twig, that little stick would be an instrument, would be a tool. Okay, so we were always machinic, but somewhere modernity has a tipping point where technology stops becoming anything human and starts to become the master of the human. Somewhere this new human stranded in a universe of wires, switches, circuits, and electric currents. An extinction of an association with organic life. Enormous computational system, a kind of godless world, but we always find a new god, we always find a new master or a new master's discourse, and the machinic is perhaps that discourse. A kind of new consumer utopia, rise of a kind of a post-social or asocial society premised on hyperconsumption, disbelief, cynicism, and a complete disregard for the organic, for the social, for the bodily. What happens in this kind of society? What happened in these 100 years? It is not possible that we changed in 100 years. It is well possible that the world changed, and we as human beings are incapable perhaps of dealing with this change in the world. And this new kind of algorithmic governmentality, the way our lives are dealt with, and the way we live life now, what could be called not a Homo sapiens anymore. Some of the thinkers have called it Homo Digitalis. A subject endlessly profiling itself, endlessly insisting upon its own existence through the repetitious posting of selfies on Instagram and other online platforms, where the only objective is to say to the world, look at me, I exist. Somebody with a profile desperately vying for attention in order to confirm their existence to themselves. This excessive Cartesian anxiety, a desperate need for some sense of recognition in a society that reduces everybody to the fate of a number. The contradictions, the conditions that impact us in the process of developing our own sense of self is the hardest. And this self then is the self psychology is dealing with today, a self colonized by numbers, a self colonized by a cybernetic dystopia, a negative sublimation, a data economy. There is nothing left but numbers and endless counting. And this situation is what perhaps, let me end with this, is not amenable anymore to the self or the subject having the capacity to deal with two of the fundamental human experiences, ache dukkho, ache mrityu. There is suffering, there are limits, there are constraints, there is death, there is an end, there is a limit, there is a finality. There is vulnerability, there is unknowability. And these are very, very difficult to deal with under the circumstances we are in. And let me end with a short take on the contemporary. We are as if in need of psychology today to come to terms with our limitations and our own mortality, in the inescapable recognition of the signs of the end, times that have been piling up since the 1970s, the realization of the limits to economic growth, the realization of the limits to progress, the financial crash, ever-increasing inequality, impending ecological disaster, including the end of life on planet, at least human life, ecological crisis, and now the coronavirus. How do we recognize, how do we come to terms with the inescapable fact of existence, vulnerability, limit points, limitations, and unknowability? It is psychology, perhaps, that can make us come to terms, reconcile with our own vulnerability, our limitations, and the fact that the omnipotence to know, omnipotence to excavate resources from the planet, omnipotence to economic growth, all of that has limits. And COVID-19 has perhaps made us come face to face with our own limits, our own limitations. Psychology as a discipline, to me, is a discipline that is most connected to human vulnerability. and most aware of the impossibility, the naivety of human omnipotence. Today, perhaps, the role of psychology becomes all the more important and all the more urgent to render us aware of our limitations. And in that sense, psychology may reinvent itself today, just like it had come to us in late 19th century. We will perhaps see psychology living up to this condition, what we are calling COVID-19, to find for ourselves a new kind of self-actualization, a kind of self-actualization that is not omnipotent, that is not grandiose, but aware of limits, vulnerabilities, and unknowabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We would now begin our interactive session. Participants are please requested to put down their questions in the chat section. We are going to read your questions out from there to the speaker one by one. We would begin our interactive session. Orunima, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Orunima, Nida? Yes, yes.
Yes,
Please
yes,
take
yes.
over. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Sir, we have few questions already from our participants. May I ask the questions now, sir?
Yes, please, please, please.
Okay, sir. At first, there were some comments from our participants from Falguni Bhattacharya, very much effective and useful topic of webinar. Saurabh Ghosh has commented, it is very informative. Now, I will move on to the question from Shubham
Go to the
Datta.
questions. Yes, yes.
Okay, sir. Heidegger argues the confronting death brings to the possibility the totality of our potentiality for being. If we go back to Tagore again and see his creative trajectory, we can see how it was crisscrossed by imprints of several deaths. Does this continual awareness of the deaths present and yet its unknowability propel Tagore to see life in botanical terms?
Should I respond to this first?
Yes, please.
Yes,
That's
sir.
how we go about, right? We
That
take
is-
one by one. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. You have really got or come very close. Let me put it. Let me not say you got it. That's a little authoritarian and condescending. Let me say you are very close to where I wanted to reach, actually. Yes. An experience of death, limitations, and it need not come only through death. Okay, though Tagore actually experienced death of his near ones, and the botanical metaphor comes from there. Perhaps that's put beautifully by you. Yes, I would tend to agree with you, and that is quite important. And when, say, I'm in a psychotherapy session, one of the and this is many psychologists in the room, perhaps. Let me put it this way, actually. What is the success of psychotherapy? Is the success of psychotherapy in making us self-actualize towards strength, or is the success of psychotherapy in making us self-actualize towards vulnerability, towards understanding, acknowledging, thinking about vulnerability, reflecting on it, working towards it, working through, as Sigmund Freud would say, working through our vulnerabilities. So in that sense, it is important, actually. to take the Heideggerian Tagorite term. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir. I am now asking the next question. It is asked by Mrs. Aparajita Chakraborty. The question is, sir, you talked about acceptance of death anxiety, but acceptance is preceded by series of other very difficult steps like denial, aggression, bargaining, and depression. How can we address these steps? Can compassion play a role to reach the acceptance, or any other factors are there to bring the acceptance?
That's also an important question, actually. That's very well put, Aparajita, Shubham, both of you. Excellent questions, I must say. Really, really excellent. Yes, yes. See, now the question is, I could not go here. What would see your last, let me, I to agree with you in the first part, so let me not open that up anymore. The question of denial, how do you deal with denial? That is very, very important. Okay. But let me come to the second part of your question, which is really something I did not speak of, but you have alerted the whole group to that. Can compassion play a role to reach the acceptance, or are there any other factors? Now, what is compassion? What is this society? What is the contemporary that doesn't render or make space for compassion, for empathy? What is there in this hyper productive, hyper efficient, hyper competitive society that cannot deal with compassion or empathy? Now, here then, see where I was trying to get at, actually, that I was not trying to say, well, now we will have a new scale to deal with COVID-19 death anxiety. No. That is not where we wanted to go, actually. That there is a role for psychology today. Just like psychology responded to the question of repression in late 19th century, the repressive hypothesis, good or bad, let's not get into that. It did respond to that, the repressive hypothesis, and produced a very sophisticated take on human life, on who we are as human beings. Okay. Similarly, today psychology can produce a very interesting take on the contemporary, a neoliberal, cybernetic, dystopic contemporary, marked by a kind of naive omnipotence, naive grandiosity, actually, that we can conquer all, including conquer the self, conquer future, conquer present. This all-conquering human subject could be put to the couch today by psychology and told to reflect on what it loses. Compassion, in your case over here, as you have put the question very well, empathy in another condition. And that is what we lacked, actually, I think, in our cities, which is why we could not host the migrant workers in our cities. What a cybernetic, dystopic, consumerist, hyper-efficient, hyper-competitive contemporary does to the human subject, does to the human self. Where is the breakdown point in the subject now? And can psychology respond to that today? So I'm actually not saying, well, psychology will now, we are not here to diagnose who has what kind and what amount of death anxiety only. Psychology has to theorize death anxiety in the contemporary. There is a task for psychology. And in that sense, psychology will have to look at the contemporary in a complex way. But your question is a very, very important. Shubham, your question also. Both are very, very important one. You can go to the next one. We don't have much time.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. The next question is from Sniktha Roy. The question is suicide not pre-decisive since the person takes control of the reins of life and death? So where does death lie on the continuum of free will and determinism?
And again, a very, very important question, actually. Today is not the day to discuss suicide, which is why I'm not getting into that. But where I will go is your last line, excessive free will and excessive premium on the self, the self's consistent obsessive need, let me put it that way, the self's obsessive need to exercise freedom in a completely predetermined world. And that is where the question of life and death will have to be worked out. Is suicide then a paradoxical taking control of free will in a determined, excessively determined contemporary? I dread to think like that, but that could be one way to think about it, a dangerous way to think about it. But yes, we will have to think dangerously. Otherwise, one is not psychological, actually. So we have to think of it in a dangerous way. That is it a last impossible mad attempt at wresting back some free will from a determined world, from an excessively determined world? How does one wrench back some free will? Is suicide that mad act? Is a question. And mad is not a bad word over here. In psychology, mad is not a bad word. In psychology, madness is something we engage with empathetically. We don't stigmatize madness. We don't diagnose madness. We understand madness. We talk to madness. We engage with madness. That's psychology. That's psychology. So it could be a mad act, an impossible mad act of taking back some will, some freedom, unthinkable freedom, tragic freedom. But that's the only freedom one can exercise. Let's go to the next one because we don't have time, but each question actually requires one more webinar. No, that's the problem. All these
Yes,
three
sir.
questions require one webinar actually. It's tough to deal with these.
So we don't have any problem. So we'll ask you to come for these webinars.
Sir, may I ask the next
go
question, please? Yes, please, sir. The question is from Paushali Banerjee. When a child gets the knowledge of death, the awareness and subsequent terrors that they must die someday are intolerable and are necessarily repressed, does this destroy the child's illusion of self-sufficiency?
Self-grandiosity, I would say, more than self-sufficiency is a middle term, actually. But self-grandiosity and overconfidence in being sufficient, in being self-sufficient, and overconfidence in thinking I can do it, and we are being pushed into that by also contemporary global capitalism as well, actually. And actually, sorry to put it this way, but it's worth pondering upon over here whether psychology will aid capitalism or diagnose capitalism. Will psychology aid capitalism and make us all very confident, or will it diagnose capitalism as a regime of narcissism? So we will not just diagnose individuals, we also want to diagnose the contemporary condition as a regime of narcissism. So as a regime of omnipotence, grandiosity, a naive grandiosity. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is from Ognimita. She has asked that Can you please explain that whether the presence alternative dealing techniques like spirituality or religion signify denial of death anxiety or a peaceful acceptance of the same, or is it just a mere coping technique?
And again, a really exceptional question, I must say. Again, it requires a separate webinar. The only clue I'll offer is that, please, this is also important actually, understanding the contemporary. A kind of faithless contemporary, a kind of despiritualized contemporary, a despiritualized contemporary. And that's why, see, psychology and spirituality, political and spirituality need to be taught all the time together, actually. One book we just edited, it's come out on July 3rd. I did not put it in my introduction, hence Navamita did not share it. It's not something she has missed. I did not put it, actually. It's a book we just published. It's titled Marxism and the Spiritual. Now, it's unthinkable that Marxism would think of spirituality. Okay, and in this book, I've interviewed the Dalai Lama, actually, and in that, a very interesting opening comes in the Dalai Lama's discussion that Buddhism is a response to the understanding that there is suffering, that there is dukkha. And in that sense, psychology could be a response to the let me put it this way, in one line. Psychology could be a spiritual, humanized response to the understanding that there is death, that there are limitations, that there are limits, there are endpoints, there are vulnerabilities, there are unknowables. Psychology could be a very scientific, technologized response to vulnerability. Psychology can also be a spiritual, humanized response to vulnerability. And what you are talking of is that, actually. In that sense, religion is psychological. Spirituality is psychological, just like psychology can be spiritual. Psychology can be humanized, okay, not technological. So that your question actually takes us in that direction, that we can see psychology as a very spiritual, humanized experience and exercise, rather than a technological one, scientific one. And we have had this history in the history of, all of you have read it in the history of psychology course, in your undergraduate history of psychology course. Is psychology a science or a kind of spirituality? Is psychology therapy? Is psychology empathy? Is psychology diagnosis? Is psychology politics? Worth pondering upon. Your question is an opening to that, but exceptional question, I must say. Yeah.
So we have 2-3 questions left. The next question is from Mr. Dhritiman Chakraborty. The question is,
whether we can agree on what you're saying as drawing limit.
Yeah, my question is, while we can agree on what you say as drawing limit, understanding vulnerability, but how can we accomplish it in a material system that endlessly look for opportunity to maximize profit, even in this COVID condition? Do we not then need a different systemic overhaul, or just a self-entered transformative politics to achieve it?
Again, oh my God. Exceptional, absolutely exceptional. See, today I was talking, and I just said, now we just edited this volume, Marxism and the Spiritual. I would have taken your questions in this form, actually, Dhritiman, if I may call you Dhritiman. Please feel free to call me Anup also. Your question is a question that could be directed at the political, where we can raise a significant question with respect to the progressivist hypothesis, that our societies are like a step ladder and they are going to progress like step ladders like this and reach some pinnacle, which heaven I don't know. Okay, Yudhishthir's walk towards heaven like that. We will keep going up and up and up. But what is going up is our COVID-19 curve. That's all that is going up. Okay. And we keep going up and up, and we don't know where we are trying to reach over there. That's the progressivist, modernist growth hypothesis, that we are going to grow no matter what. And that really needs to be taught. But today I was talking to psychologists primarily. Hence, I was tilted in the direction of the self and less towards structurality. However, you may have noticed in my answer, I said it, that psychology may question the Anthropocene. Psychology may question ecological planetary crisis. Psychology may now tell global capitalism that this is no way to live, my dear. We have messed it up all. Let us rethink the way we can live. In that sense, see, Dhridiman, I'm actually saying this as a kind of a troubling footnote. Let me say this, okay? And sorry to put it this way. Please don't feel bad about it. There is one way we can serve the contemporary. The other way is to question the contemporary. And in psychology's history, we have had both trends. At times, psychology has served the contemporary. At times, psychology has questioned the contemporary. And the two figures who have come up in today's discussion, Heidegger and Tagore, both question the contemporary. I'll give you one line over here, if I have the time. Think of one thing. Rabindranath Tagore, Nobel laureate, could have got a literature lecturer's job, nowadays called assistant professor, in one of the colleges in Calcutta under Calcutta University. Why did he not take up that job? What he did was not take up a Calcutta University lecturer's job, traveled all the way to a Santhal Adivasi Pargana, Lalmati Desh, land of red soil, sold his property, jewelry, and set up his own institution, his own university, his own school. And this is what we Bengalis miss. Tagore was a critique of the contemporary. He was a critique of the British university system called University of Calcutta. Hence, he set up his own university or non-university. And he tried to do something else. So psychology similarly, and this was Girindra Shekhar Bose actually, somebody who questioned psychology rather than taught psychology. Somebody who questioned psychoanalysis, he questioned Sigmund Freud rather than practiced psychoanalysis. So in that sense, Dhritimansi, psychology can serve the contemporary, psychology may question the contemporary. And all the earlier questions are connected to questioning the contemporary. Next.
So we have two more questions left. The next question is from Mrs. Bornali. The question is, you spoke about the cybernetic dystopia. Sir, would you agree that we are perhaps in a way looking at a large-scale disappearance of anything called an individual in this age of artificial intelligence? That is, individual in the sense of one that cannot be divided any further. Because even before the pandemic scenario, we have been looking at a series of virtual collectives and actual individual isolation. Also, can logotherapy be revisited to suggest a way out of this brave new world?
It's a good question. It's a tough question, actually. I won't be able to do justice to this question. because we have already gone beyond 5 p.m. Now, how many minutes do we have?
16.
Huh?
So you can extend. Naumika, you just unmute.
You can take a little more time, sir. There's no constraint as such. You can take 15, 20
Actually, there's no
minutes.
constraint.
problem.
This is not going to get switched off or anything. No, not like that.
No problem.
Let's have a human interaction. Huh? Let's me not treat these questions as some arrows, and I just return them back. This is Bornali. Bornali, it's a wonderful question, Bornali. I will not be able to do justice to this question, actually. This is my doubt, actually. Though when I spoke, the doubt did not come. And this is perhaps the problem of speaking also, speaking within a time limit. All the doubts don't come. My doubt over here is, and I did not get the time to get into that, the whole Prometheus question in Greek mythology. The doubt is that the human is by default kind of tied to the machine, tied to technique, tied to a process where the human will not be able to manage or do it with just the body. Think of an animal. The animal does not use tools. The animal would do what it can do, what she or he can do, with what she or he has, claws, teeth, whatever. We use tools. So we are constitutively machinic. There's no way out. There's no escape from this. And we are using tools now. We are using the cyberspace actually to talk to each other. And there is no escape from this. But that is why I did say that, but could not really explore it. And my doubts did not show, which is not good, because then you look confident. Where is the tipping point then? How far will we go with machinic, cybernetic utopias? How far can we go? Is the planet, is the ecology, is Earth the limit? Is there a tipping point in modernity? Jab hum bhool gaye. It's like a car. You can drive it up to 100 kilometers an hour. You go beyond it, you hit a light post. So how far can we go is a question we will have to really ask. How much can we whip our inner omnipotence? I'm trying to speak in a psychological language, okay? I don't want to go into general discussions of Marxism, economics, progressivism. And that problem is there. And what would be then the balance? And Girinder Shekhar Bose actually showed us something very, very interesting. The philosophy of the seesaw, that we are in a seesaw. The human psyche is a seesaw. Say between the pleasure principle and beyond the pleasure principle. Say between Eros and Thanatos. And he always saw this as a seesaw. And the seesaw is interesting because the seesaw takes us, and that is how he saw psychotherapy. That is how he saw psychoanalysis. Very different from how Freud saw psychoanalysis. It was not an escape from repression to freedom. That's impossible. What you can do is to bring a balance to this seesaw. And all of psychological, psychotherapeutic work is to find that contingent balance given your life history. In that sense, it's a seesaw. Where is the balance? I myself don't know. But currently it looks like we are in an imbalance between our organicity, our corporeality, our humanness, our animality, the animal that therefore I am. And on the other hand, a kind of omnipotent, grandiose, aggressive, competitive, hyper-efficient, strong self. What is the balance between strength and vulnerability? Technology and the planet. This is where we are working. This is the tension between the two. So Bornali, see, and this doubt may not have come when I was presenting. So I'm not damning the cybernetic as a dystopia. No, I'm not condemning it. But how do we find a balance between free will and determinism, as some of your friends have already pointed out very well, I must say, between an excessive freedom and a determined unfreedom, between strength and vulnerability, knowability and unknowability? That's the balance that has to be found, actually. How do we find that balance? A balance between maybe efficiency and compassion. How do we find a balance between these two is the question. So I would say between virtual collectives and actual individual isolation, between solitude and solidarity, how do we find a human balance? How do we find a spiritual, psychological balance between solitude and solidarity? How do we reach that balance is the question. And that is why I said psychology has a very important role in the contemporary, because psychology helps us find that balance between thinking I'm fine and thinking I'm completely unwell, between thinking the mother did not love me or thinking I got all the love from my mother. So psychology produces a complex balance between extremes we occupy. So how do we not occupy extremes and find a balance is the question. That is why I said there is a tremendous role for psychology in today's world, but psychology also needs to then critique the contemporary. We can go to the next.
Okay,
that much
the last
for today.
question of the session.
That much
Okay,
for
thank you so much, sir. The last question of the session is from Swapna. The question is, sir, you mentioned about the paradox where when you experience death, you no longer remain to experience it. However, you spoke of a perspective where death is flanked by life on its both sides. So, sir, isn't the concept of afterlife and contradiction to that paradox?
See, again, I will go back to that very beautiful question on spirituality that came up actually. It actually depends on how you look at life. As I have said it again and again now, I think I have said it a number of times now. How we look at life, how we understand life, what is life? One way I think human beings try to make sense, and I'm just remembering, I keep remembering Girindra Shekhar Bose, I keep remembering Rabindranath when I'm in difficulty, when I'm in a crisis, when I'm in a problem, when I don't have an answer. And I'm remembering Girindra Shekhar Bose in the Yoga Sutra book. The book begins with is a discussion on Brahman. What is Brahma? What is Brahman? And he tries to argue that Brahman, and of course I'm interpreting it, I'm reading it in my own way. Brahman is a kind of experience of the unknown, the experience of the human who is really vulnerable in the world, in the planet. And even a little bit of lightning is a death anxiety for this human. This human can be killed by that. So these were attempts, actually. Is the death ritual, the concept of afterlife, the concept of rebirth, the concept of heaven, the concept of a space after life that I will occupy. Okay? All attempts to alleviate the anxiety to death. What will we do now in a godless, faithless, spirituality-less world is a question Swapnakalpo is a question. And you can have a more difficult view. Let me put it this way. I think I'm getting the angle again from Girindra Shekhar Bose. The seesaw is between, on the one hand, thinking there is an afterlife. Life, death, afterlife. One pole of the seesaw. The other pole of the seesaw is to see death, life, death. Inorganic, organicity, and then inorganic again. Something Freud tried to open up in his discussion. What is it to find the balance? Find a middle path. And a middle path is not a midpoint. Find a middle path. Middle path is Buddhist. A middle path between these two polarities, these two poles of the seesaw. Life, death, afterlife, death, inorganicity, life, inorganicity. Now, why do I say this? I say this because how we think about life and death will determine how we will run our scales, how we will set up our scales, how we will interpret what somebody has, quote unquote, put as a response. The underlying philosophy of how we look at ourselves and the world and life and death will determine actually how we will do psychology, how we will run a scale, how we will understand the response. And Swapnakalpo, that is the question. And how do we think of this seesaw between these two? Yes, there is a paradox. The paradox is the paradox of the seesaw, actually, to go to one extreme, to go to one polarity. But how do we not lapse into polarities and see how does one deal with the extremes? Orunima.
Thank you so much, sir. There is no more question, but the chat box is flooded with the overwhelming responses of our participants. Thank you so much for such an enlightening session, sir. Now I will hand it over to Navamita.
Thank you very much, sir. Before beginning the vote of thanks, I would remind the participants that the feedback form link has been given. Many of you have already filled it up, but you will need to fill it up even if you have filled it up yesterday. So please, all of you fill it up. It is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks speech and acknowledge the contribution of those who worked really hard to make this webinar happen. On behalf of the Department of Psychology, Gokhale Memorial Girls College, I extend a hearty vote of thanks to our esteemed and very distinguished speaker, Professor Anup Dhar, who spared time from his very busy schedule to grace the occasion by his presence. His thoughts have enlightened our minds and enriched us. Words are really literally failing to communicate my feelings of deep indebtedness and gratitude towards you, sir. Thank you very much. I am immensely thankful to our principal madam, Dr. Otoshi Karfa, and would also express my heartfelt sense of appreciation for our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Shunchita Shen. An event does not happen overnight. The wheels start rolling weeks ago. It requires planning and a bird's eye for detail. It was my good fortune to be backed by a very, very proactive and dedicated team, members of the department. Thank you very much for all your cooperation, involvement, and willingness to go beyond your comfort zone. Mr. Akash Mondol deserves to be given wholehearted appreciation for the technical support that he has provided. He has consistently been bridging the yawning gap between our technological ambitions and competence. Finally, the participants. I really cannot thank you enough for the generous and overwhelming response that this event has been greeted with. The registration had to be reopened to accommodate the huge interest and response. I hope you all have gained new insights, and the reward for coming has been proportionate to the response that you had given. I thank all of you on behalf of the Department of Psychology, and participants, thank you for asking questions that would require separate webinars to answer adequately. We would get excuses to invite Professor Dhar again and again to our department. With that, we come to an end of this session. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, everyone. Please fill up the feedback forms participants that is connected to your certificate.
Thank you.